Greetings, this is Griff Ruby, presenting what I call Foundation's Progress, or a history of Dr. Asimov's Foundation series, based on a number of comments by himself. There are two events occurring within young Isaac Asimov's life in 1937, when he was 17 years old, which have relevance to the very existence, let alone nature, of the Foundation series. One was that he had decided, on May 29, 1937 to be precise, to begin attempting to write stories for professional publication, commencing with his now lost story, Cosmic Corkscrew. The other was his first reading of Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, an extraordinary, if somewhat slanted or biased, and now very much dated, recounting of history, which was and remained primary source for the Foundation series, along with The Historian's History of the World, a 1907 vintage 24-volume collection of historical writings, and perhaps some input from the Greek historian Thucydides. As will be seen later, the historical writings of Arnold Toynbee would also be a factor into one segment, Dead Hand. These historical sources provide primarily the dramatic backdrop of a dying empire, the Roman Empire in actual history, and the archetype of the dying galactic empire in the future history of the Foundation times. As an unknown editorial publicist at Astounding once wrote, there are really two stages in a culture that produce eras of romantic adventure, when it is collapsing and when, renaissance, it is coming out of its eclipse into a new form. And what fall could be greater in scope and scale than the fall of a galactic empire, which had previously endured for some at least 12,000 years or so? And all the more so with a story series focused on the germ of a second galactic empire due to rise 1,000 years later. Though Cosmic Corkscrew is a lost story, what little is remembered of it pertains to a character's transposition to a future time in which humanity had recently destroyed itself. Due to the corkscrew nature of time, hence the title, the character was unable to go back a small enough increment of time to observe exactly what had happened to cause this massive extinction. With everyone dead, he must glean from whatever artifacts remained what it was that had happened to them. Perhaps enough is remembered of that story to account for about 4,000 words of it, yet it is listed as having been 9,000 words, and one has to wonder if some sort of decline and fall series of events proved to be the cause of the extinction is found by the time traveler, and the content of the remaining 5,000 words. But as the story is lost, we will never know for sure. Likewise, we will never know if another lost story, The Decline and Fall, written in February of 1939, might possibly have involved a fall on something of an interplanetary, interstellar, or even galactic scale. We do know that the very next story he set down to writing directly after the now lost Decline and Fall was a future historical in many ways in the manner of the Foundation, and bearing several features in common with it. The first and most obvious of those features is the bare fact that it was a future historical, written as if from a time yet further future still, regarding a remotely future time of galactic-scaled empires and conquests. In I. Asimov, page 116, he writes, "I have described my early interest in history, my urge to major in that field, and even to go for my Ph.D. in it. I cast all that aside because I didn't think it would work out well. I went for chemistry instead, but my interest in history remained. I love historical novels, if they contain neither too much violence nor too much sleazy sex, and I still read them today whenever I get a chance. Naturally, just as loving science fiction led me to the desire to write science fiction, the love of historical novels led me to the desire to write historical novels. To write a historical novel was, however, impractical for me. It would require an enormous amount of reading and research, and I just couldn't spend all that time at it. I wanted to write. Early on, then, it occurred to me that I could write a historical novel if I made up my own history. In other words, I might write a historical novel of the future, a science fiction story that read like a historical novel. Now, I don't pretend that I made up the idea of writing histories of the future. It had been done numerous times, most effectively and startlingly by the British writer Olaf Stapledon, who wrote First and Last Men and The Star Makers. These books, however, read like histories, and I wanted to write a historical novel, a story with conversation and action just like any other science fiction story, except that it would deal not only with technology, but with political and sociological problems. It is in the context of these interests that Asimov drafted his earliest surviving future historical, originally titled Pilgrimage, but published as Black Friar of the Flame. In the early Asimov, page 99, he goes on to describe features in common between the Pilgrimage Crusade Black Friar of the Flame story and his Foundation series. Quote, on March 4, 1939, I began my most ambitious writing project to that date. It was a novelette in which I named an important character after Russell Winterbotham that was intended to be at least twice as long as any of my previous stories. I called the story Pilgrimage. It was my first attempt to write a future history. That is, a tale about a far future time written as though it were a historical novel. It was also my first attempt to write a story on a galactic scale. Or at least the first we know that we remember. I was very excited while working at it and felt somehow that it was an epic. I remember, though, that Winterbotham was rather dubious about it when I described the plot to him in a letter. I brought it in to Campbell on March 21, 1939, with high hopes. But it was back on the 24th with a letter that said, you have a basic idea which might be made into an interesting yarn, but as it is not strong enough. End quote. Again, from pages 142 to 143, he continues, quote, for some reason, possibly because of the awful title, for which I emphatically disclaim responsibility, Black Friar of the Flame is taken as the quintessence of my early incompetence. At least, fans who come across a copy think they can embarrass me by referring to it. Well, it isn't good, I admit, but it has its interesting points. For one thing, it is an obvious precursor to my successful Foundation series. In Black Friar of the Flame, as in the Foundation series, human beings occupy many planets, and two worlds mentioned in the former, Trantor and Santani, and by the way, this is a third, Vega, which plays a substantially different role in Foundation as a vanillite source of ultimate tobacco and a province, a world described as having an impressive space navy. That it does in Black Friar, which is as the main or home planet of the conquering alien lizard-like Xenu, also play important roles in the latter. Indeed, the first of the Foundation series was to appear only a couple of months after Black Friar of the Flame, thanks to the delay in selling the latter. Furthermore, there is also a strong suggestion in Black Friar of the Flame of my first book-length novel, Pebble in the Sky, which was to appear 8 years later. In both, the situation I pictured on Earth was inspired by that of Judea under the Romans. The climatic battle in Black Friar of the Flame, however, was inspired by that of the Battle of Salamis, the great victory of the Greeks over the Persians. In telling future history, I always felt it wisest to be guided by past history. This was true in the Foundation series, too. This is the earliest surviving appearance of an important motif of a large civilization, galactic scale, having at least largely forgotten Earth as the original planet of mankind, and usually despising it if they remember it at all, not counting small but virulently pro-Earth parties such as the Lorists of Black Friar. By the era of Pebble in the Sky, with the original galactic empire in its full flower, Earth is primarily inhabited by dark-skinned races, maybe from too much radiation, about for the delicate and sensitive skin of light-skinned races. and also looked down upon as members of such races often were in the days when Pebble in the Sky was published. To create an atmosphere of such great distance into the future, as a literary device, Asimov had Lord Darwin bring up the so-called origin question, or origin question, could be accent as he wrote it down, regarding where humanity came from, thus placing things in a time so far future that even the very planet of human origin is altogether forgotten, lost to history, and even debated among archaeologists. But even that is mirrored by the lack of exact information humanity has even in our own time, and even throughout the existence of the Roman Empire as covered by Gibbon, as to where humanity first appeared on this earth. However, despite such a rich background of historical data, which provides so much detail to the nature and manner of an empire's disintegration and motivation for Hari Seldon's efforts, there is much to the Foundation series which simply must have drawn from other sources. For example, the whole science of psychohistory, the foundations, and the mental powers of both the mule to overthrow and of the second foundation to restore, have no clear analogues in the history covered by Gibbons. When the real Roman Empire was falling, there was no Seldon Foundation-like concerted effort to preserve the art, science, and culture of the empire for restoration of the empire within a short period of time. At most, in real history, there would have been only those all too many souls at once victims and yet also on the sideline, who could sense and detect as strongly and reliably as Hari Seldon could calculate the coming fall of the empire, but were powerless not only to stop it, but even to make any consequential efforts towards any subsequent restoration. Other sources and influences come from facts and events much closer to Dr. Asimov's own life, and his relationship with his editor at the time, John Campbell. Among these is the notion of psychology as having finally become an exact mathematical science in the true hard science sense of the expression. In the story, The Imaginary, psychology was portrayed as being an exact and mathematical science, a foreshadowing, as he puts it in the early Asimov, page 245. Quote, "The chief interest to me in The Imaginary is that it foreshadows the psychohistory that was to play such a big role in the Foundation series. It was in this story and in its predecessor, Homo Soul, that for the first time I treated psychology as a mathematically refined science." In a 1987 interview published in the journal Science Fiction Studies, Asimov explained the role of physical chemistry science he was studying in providing yet another basis for the idea of psychohistory. Quote, "I wanted to consider essentially the science of psychohistory, something I made up myself. It was, in a sense, the struggle between free will and determinism. On the other hand, I wanted to do a story on the analogy of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, but on the much larger scale of the galaxy. To do that, I took over the aura of the Roman Empire and wrote it very large. The social system, then, is very much like the Roman imperial system, but that was just my skeleton. At the time I started these stories, I was taking physical chemistry at school, and I knew that because the individual molecules of a gas move quite erratically and randomly, nobody can predict the direction of motion of a single molecule at any particular time. The randomness of their motion works out to the point where you can predict the total behavior of the gas very accurately using the gas laws. I knew that if you decrease the volume, the pressure goes up. If you raise the temperature, the pressure goes up. And if the volume expands, And we know these things even though we don't know how individual molecules behave. It seemed to me that if we did have a galactic empire, there would be so many human beings, quintillions of them, that perhaps you might be able to predict very accurately how societies would behave, even though you couldn't predict how individuals composing those societies would behave. So against the background of the Roman Empire written large, I invented the science of psychohistory. Throughout the entire trilogy, then, there are the opposing forces of individual desire and that dead hand of social inevitability." I'm going to cut off part 1 right here.